The college campus debate had been promoted for weeks as a clash of ideologies, with Turning Point USA founder Charlie Kirk bringing his You're Being Indoctrinated tour to the University of Michigan and agreeing to a moderated debate with a Democratic elected official on the topic of economic policy. The auditorium was packed with a predictable mix: conservative students in Turning Point merchandise occupying the front rows, progressive counter-protesters in the balcony, and a substantial center section of genuinely undecided students who had come to hear both sides. Kirk sat on stage with the relaxed confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times, his entire career built on the premise that he could out-debate any liberal using basic economic principles and conservative talking points that resonated with young audiences. When Jasmine Crockett walked onto the stage carrying a slim leather folder, Kirk's expression shifted to something between amusement and anticipation. He had built his brand on dismantling progressive politicians in front of young audiences, and he clearly expected this to be another such occasion. The moderator, a political science professor from the university, outlined the format: 30 minutes of structured debate on economic policy, with each participant getting opening statements, rebuttals, and audience questions. Kirk would argue that conservative free market policies create prosperity. Crockett would argue that progressive policies create broadly shared economic growth. Before the moderator could finish the ground rules, Kirk leaned into his microphone. "I just want to say up front that I appreciate Representative Crockett agreeing to this debate. Most Democratic politicians won't engage with conservative students because they know their policies can't withstand scrutiny. So I respect her willingness to be here, even though I think by the end of tonight, these students will see why progressive economics always fails." His tone was dripping with condescension, the verbal equivalent of patting her on the head before a sparring match. Kirk launched into his opening statement with the practiced energy of a motivational speaker, pacing the stage as he delivered talking points about tax cuts creating growth, regulation strangling innovation, and free markets lifting people out of poverty. He spoke about Venezuela and Cuba as cautionary tales of socialism. He referenced Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. He got applause from the conservative students when he declared that the only moral economic system was one based on voluntary exchange and individual liberty rather than government coercion. When he sat down, he was visibly pleased with himself, clearly confident he had established the framework that would dominate the rest of the evening. The moderator turned to Crockett for her opening response. She thanked the university for hosting and then opened her folder to reveal 6 documents, each marked with a different colored tab. "Mr. Kirk just gave you a compelling speech about free market economics. It was well delivered, energetic, passionate, and almost completely disconnected from actual economic data. Over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to show you 6 documents that demonstrate the gap between conservative economic theory and economic reality." She pulled out the first document marked with a red tab. "Let's start with Mr. Kirk's central claim that tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations create economic growth that benefits everyone. This is sometimes called trickle-down economics or supply-side economics. It's been tested multiple times in American history. Let's see what actually happened." She held up the document so the audience could see it was a Congressional Research Service report. This is a 2012 Congressional Research Service analysis of 65 years of tax policy and economic growth. It examined every major tax cut and tax increase from 1945 to 2010. The conclusion, and I'm reading directly from the report: the reduction in the top tax rates appears to be uncorrelated with economic growth. The top tax rates appear to have little or no relation to the size of the economic pie, but have instead been associated with the size of the slice claimed by the top income earners. She looked up. "In plain English, tax cuts for the wealthy don't increase overall economic growth. They just increase the share of the economy that goes to wealthy people. The pie doesn't get bigger. Rich people just get a bigger slice." Kirk immediately interjected. "Representative, with all due respect, you're citing a report from 2012 that uses outdated methodology. Modern economic analysis clearly shows that when you reduce the tax burden on job creators, they invest that money in their businesses, which creates jobs and grows the economy. That's basic economics." Crockett didn't miss a beat. "Let's test that theory with modern data then." She pulled out the second document marked with a blue tab. "This is data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics covering the past 40 years. I'm going to show you what happened after every major tax cut during that period." She displayed a simple chart. 1981, Reagan tax cuts reduced top rate from 70% to 50%. Average GDP growth over the next 3 years to 6%. Average wage growth for median workers, 0, 3%. 1986, Reagan tax reform reduces top rate to 28%. Average GDP growth over next 3 years, 3, 5%. Average wage growth for median workers, 0, 1%. 2001 and 2003, Bush tax cuts reduced top rate to 35%. Average GDP growth over next 3 years, 2, 1%. Average wage growth for median workers, negative 0, 2%. 2017, Trump tax cuts reduced corporate rate from 35% to 21%. GDP growth over next 3 years, 2, 5%. Median wage growth, 1%. She looked directly at Kirk. Now let's compare that to periods with higher tax rates. 1993, Clinton raises top rate from 31% to 39, 6%. Average GDP growth over next 3 years, 3, 7%. Median wage growth, 2, 1%. That's faster GDP growth and significantly faster wage growth than any of the tax cut periods. So the actual data contradicts your theory. When we raised taxes on the wealthy in 1993, we got better growth and better wages than when we cut taxes in 1981, 2001, or 2017. Kirk's face flushed. Representative, you're cherry-picking time periods to make your point. The 1990s had growth because of the tech boom, not because of tax increases. Any economist will tell you that correlation doesn't equal causation. Crockett nodded slowly. You're absolutely right that correlation doesn't equal causation, which is exactly why your claim that tax cuts cause growth is problematic. You're claiming causation based on a theory. I'm showing you that the correlation you claim exists doesn't actually exist in the data. Sometimes we cut taxes and got weak growth. Sometimes we raised taxes and got strong growth. The variable that matters isn't the tax rate, so what is it? She pulled out the third document marked with a green tab. This is a National Bureau of Economic Research study on the actual drivers of economic growth. It analyzed 50 years of data across all 50 states to identify what policies correlate with sustained economic growth. The strongest correlations weren't with tax rates. They were with education spending, infrastructure investment, and research and development funding. States that invested more in public education had 8% higher annual GDP growth on average. States that invested more in infrastructure had 3% higher growth. States that invested more in R&D had 1% higher growth. She looked out at the audience. In other words, the government investments that Mr. Kirk would probably call wasteful spending are actually the strongest predictors of economic growth, not tax cuts. Public investment, Kirk stood up, clearly agitated. Okay, now you're just promoting big government spending as the solution to everything. Let me explain something about basic economics that apparently they didn't teach in whatever political science program the representative attended. His tone had shifted from condescending to openly dismissive. When the government spends money, it has to either tax that money from productive citizens or borrow it, which crowds out private investment. Every dollar the government spends is a dollar that can't be invested by private companies who would use it more efficiently. This is Economics 101. Government spending doesn't create growth. It redistributes wealth and reduces efficiency. Crockett's expression didn't change. Mr. Kirk, I noticed you just made an assumption about my education. For the record, I have a law degree from Southern Methodist University, and I've studied economics as it relates to public policy extensively. But let's address your Economics 101 claim with some Economics 301 data. She pulled out the fourth document marked with a yellow tab. This is a study from the International Monetary Fund examining the fiscal multiplier. That's the economic term for how much GDP increases for every dollar of government spending. The IMF analyzed data from 28 advanced economies over 30 years. They found that during economic downturns, government spending has a multiplier between 1, 5, and 2, 0. That means every dollar the government spends generates between $1.50 and 2.40 in total economic activity. She held up the document. Now let's compare that to tax cuts. The same study found that tax cuts, especially tax cuts for high earners, have a multiplier between 0, 3 and 0, 6. Every dollar in tax cuts generates only 30 to 60 cents in economic activity. So your Economics 101 claim is backwards. Government spending is more economically efficient than tax cuts, not less. The data is unambiguous. Kirk's voice rose. The IMF is a left-wing international organization that promotes big government. I'm not surprised they found what they were looking for. But if you ask actual free market economists, Crockett interrupted. Let's ask them then. She pulled out the fifth document marked with an orange tab. This is a survey of economists conducted by the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. They surveyed 43 leading economists across the political spectrum, including many conservative and libertarian economists, and asked them whether government spending has a positive multiplier effect during recessions. 36 said yes, 4 said uncertain, 3 said no. That's 84% of economists, including conservative ones, agreeing that government spending stimulates growth during downturns. Kirk shook his head. Academic economists live in ivory towers. They don't understand how the real economy works. Let's talk about the real world. Small business owners, entrepreneurs, job creators, they'll all tell you that taxes and regulations are strangling their ability to grow. That's the reality that matters, not what some survey of professors says. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Let's talk about small business owners then, since you brought them up. This is the 6th document. She pulled out a paper marked with a purple tab. This is the National Federation of Independent Businesses quarterly survey of small business owners. They ask owners to identify their biggest challenges. I'm going to read you the top 5 challenges from the most recent survey. Number 1, finding qualified workers. Number 2, cost of labor. Number 3, supply chain disruptions. Number 4, inflation. Number 5, insurance costs. She looked up. Taxes and regulations don't appear in the top 5. They're not even in the top 10. When you actually ask small business owners what's limiting their growth, they don't say taxes. They say they can't find qualified workers, which is an education and workforce development issue. They say labor costs too much, which is a productivity and automation issue. They say supply chains are disrupted and inflation is high and insurance is expensive. None of those problems are solved by cutting taxes on wealthy people or corporations. She wasn't finished. But here's what's really interesting in this data. The NFIB survey also asked small business owners what would help them most. Number 1 answer, better access to qualified workers. Number 2, lower health insurance costs. Number 3, better infrastructure for logistics and shipping. All 3 of those are things that government investment can address. Education and training programs create qualified workers. A public health care option or stronger ACA marketplaces reduce insurance costs. Infrastructure spending improves logistics. So when you actually ask small business owners what they need, they're asking for exactly the kind of government investment that your ideology says is wasteful. Kirk's hands were balled into fists. Representative Crockett, you spent the last 15 minutes throwing statistics and studies at me, but you're missing the fundamental moral point. It's not the government's money, it's the taxpayers' money. And people have a right to keep what they earn rather than having it confiscated to fund programs they don't support. That's the principle that matters more than any economic study. Crockett's voice was quiet but sharp. Mr. Kirk, you've now made 3 shifts in your argument. First, you claim tax cuts create growth. I showed you data proving that's false. Second, you claimed government spending is inefficient. I showed you multiplier data proving that's false. Third, you claim small businesses want lower taxes. I showed you survey data proving they want other things more. Now you're shifting to a moral argument about property rights because the economic arguments all failed. She stood now, matching his earlier positioning. But let's address the moral argument. You say it's not the government's money, it's the taxpayers' money. Okay, let's talk about where that money comes from and where it goes. She held up all 6 documents together. These studies I've shown you demonstrate something important. Economic growth doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires educated workers, which requires public schools and universities. It requires infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports, electrical grids, which requires public investment. It requires basic research, which is overwhelmingly funded by government because private companies won't fund research that might not produce profits for decades. It requires a legal system to enforce contracts, a military to provide security, a regulatory system to prevent fraud. She paused. Mr. Kirk, you talk about taxpayers' money as though it's something that exists separate from government. But the wealth that generates tax revenue only exists because of the public investments that make economic activity possible. Nobody gets rich alone. They get rich using roads the public paid for, with employees educated in public schools, selling to customers who have money because of economic growth that public investment enabled. So the question isn't whether people have a right to keep what they earn. The question is what portion of the collective prosperity enabled by collective investment should be reinvested in maintaining and expanding the systems that make prosperity possible. Kirk pointed at her. That is socialist thinking. What you're describing is the government taking more and more of people's earnings and redistributing it according to bureaucrats' priorities instead of individuals' choices. That's the road to Venezuela. Crockett's response was immediate. Mr. Kirk, you've mentioned Venezuela 3 times tonight. Let's talk about Venezuela. The Venezuelan economy collapsed because of government corruption, oil price crashes, and authoritarian mismanagement, not because of progressive taxation or public investment. But since you want to compare countries, let's do that. She held up the third document again. This NBER study looked at economic growth across developed countries. The countries with the highest sustained growth over the past 30 years are Nordic countries: Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland. All of them have top tax rates between 55 and 60%. All of them have extensive social programs. All of them have strong unions. And all of them have higher GDP per capita, higher median incomes, better health outcomes, longer life expectancy, and higher reported happiness than the United States. She looked directly at Kirk. So if your theory is correct, if high taxes and government spending destroy prosperity, why are the countries with the highest taxes and most government spending also the most prosperous and the happiest? The data from the real world contradicts your theory. Kirk's face had gone red. Those are small, homogeneous countries with totally different circumstances. You can't compare them to America? Crockett smiled slightly. Interesting. When the comparison favors your argument, we should learn from other countries. When it doesn't, the countries are too different to compare. But let's talk about America specifically then. She gestured to all 6 documents. Every piece of data I've shown you tonight is from American sources analyzing American economic history. Congressional Research Service analyzing 65 years of American tax policy. Bureau of Economic Analysis tracking American GDP growth. Bureau of Labor Statistics tracking American wages. NBER studying American states. University of Chicago surveying American economists. NFIB surveying American small business owners. All American data, all showing the same pattern. Tax cuts for the wealthy don't increase growth, government spending does, and public investment in education and infrastructure are the strongest predictors of prosperity. She sat back down. Mr. Kirk, you came here tonight to lecture college students about economics. You presented a theory about how the economy works. Tax cuts good, government spending bad, free markets always efficient. I've shown you 6 different sources of data demonstrating that the theory doesn't match reality. At some point, you have to decide whether you care more about your ideology or about what actually works. The silence that followed was profound. Kirk sat frozen, visibly trying to formulate a response. 10 seconds. 15. The conservative students who had been applauding his earlier points were quiet now. 20 seconds. Finally, Kirk spoke, and his voice had lost all its earlier bravado. Representative Crockett, I appreciate that you've brought a lot of studies and statistics. But at the end of the day, I trust freedom more than I trust government. I trust individuals to make better decisions about their own money than bureaucrats. And I think most Americans agree with that principle, regardless of what academic studies say. Crockett's response was gentle, almost kind. Mr. Kirk, that's a perfectly legitimate value system. You value individual liberty and minimal government. I respect that as a philosophical position. But tonight's debate wasn't about values. It was about economics. You made empirical claims that tax cuts create growth, that government spending is inefficient, that small businesses are held back by taxes. Those are testable claims. And I tested them with data. The data proved them false. She gestured to the 6 documents on the table in front of her. You can believe in limited government as a moral principle and still acknowledge that the economic theories used to justify it don't hold up under scrutiny. You can value freedom and individual choice and still admit that sometimes collective action through government produces better economic outcomes than purely private markets. There's no contradiction there. What's problematic is claiming that your political preferences are supported by economic science when the economic science says the opposite. The moderator, sensing the debate had reached its natural conclusion, opened the floor to audience questions. Several students asked follow-ups about specific policies, student loan forgiveness, healthcare reform, climate change economics, and each time, Kirk would make theoretical arguments about market efficiency and individual choice, and Crockett would respond with data from government agencies or academic studies showing that the theoretical arguments didn't match real-world outcomes. By the time the debate ended, the pattern was undeniable. Kirk was arguing from theory and values. Crockett was arguing from evidence and data, and every time the two collided, the evidence contradicted the theory. The footage would go viral within hours. Not the entire 90-minute debate, but specifically the segment where Crockett laid out all 6 documents. News outlets created graphics showing each document and its key finding. Document 1, Congressional Research Service, tax cuts don't increase growth. Document 2, BA-BLS data, higher taxes in 1993 led to better growth than tax cuts in other periods. Document 3, NBER study, education and infrastructure spending predict growth better than tax rates. Document 4, IMF study, government spending has higher multiplier effect than tax cuts. Document 5, Chicago Booth survey, 84% of economists agree government spending stimulates growth. Document 6, NFIB survey, small businesses want qualified workers and infrastructure, not tax cuts. Within 24 hours, several conservative commentators would try to defend Kirk by attacking the sources, calling the Congressional Research Service biased, the IMF left-wing academic economists out of touch. But those defenses collapsed when fact-checkers pointed out that Kirk himself had cited these same sources in the past when they seemed to support conservative positions. He had cited CRS reports on other topics. He had referenced IMF data on other countries. He had quoted academic economists when they criticized progressive policies. The sources weren't the problem. The problem was that when properly examined, they contradicted his claims. Within a week, the debate would be used in college economics courses as an example of the difference between economic theory and economic evidence. Several professors would assign students to fact-check both participants' claims, and every fact-check would come back the same way. Crockett's claims were supported by the sources she cited. Kirk's claims were contradicted by empirical data. What truly ended Charlie Kirk's credibility as an economic commentator wasn't any single document. It was the cumulative weight of 6 different sources from 6 different institutions all telling the same story. The conservative economic theories he had built his brand on were not supported by economic evidence. Tax cuts don't create broadly shared growth. Government spending does stimulate the economy. Public investment matters more than tax rates. Small businesses care more about workforce and infrastructure than taxes. The Nordic countries with high taxes are prosperous. Every major empirical claim of supply-side economics failed when tested against actual data. And Charlie Kirk, faced with this evidence, had no response except to say he trusted freedom more than he trusted data, which was an admission that his economic views were based on ideology rather than evidence, which was fine as a philosophical position, but devastating for someone who had built a career lecturing others about how economics really works. Kirk had come to the University of Michigan to lecture Jasmine Crockett on economics. He had condescended to her about Economics 101. He had dismissed her as a typical liberal politician who didn't understand how the real economy works. And she had responded by opening 6 documents that systematically dismantled every empirical claim he had made. 6 documents, 6 sources, 6 refutations. Congressional Research Service, your central theory is wrong. Bureau of Economic Analysis, your historical claims are wrong. National Bureau of Economic Research, your policy prescriptions are backwards. International Monetary Fund, your efficiency claims are wrong. University of Chicago, your economists disagree with you. National Federation of Independent Business, your small business claims are wrong. By the time she finished, there was nothing left of his economic argument except the value claim that freedom matters more than evidence, which was true for him apparently, but not compelling for anyone interested in what actually works. Charlie Kirk lectured Jasmine Crockett on economics. She opened 6 documents, and his credibility as an economic commentator ended. Not because she had better rhetoric, not because she had a more compelling ideology, but because she had evidence and he had theory, and when the two collided, the evidence won.